The quietest revolutions never announce themselves. They arrive like dawn slipping into the night sky, unnoticed at first, until the world glows with a light you can no longer deny. Healing is such a revolution. It does not roar like battle drums, nor does it display itself with banners or decorations. Instead, it whispers through the soul, reshaping the woman who once thought herself broken, until she moves with a strength so natural she forgets it was ever foreign. Carl Jung once wrote that the soul speaks through symbols, not through reason. Healing, too, speaks symbolically. It hides in the subtle gestures of your daily life, in the way your chest no longer tightens at the sound of an old name, or in the way silence begins to feel like a sanctuary instead of a punishment. These are the unspoken signs that transformation has already begun its work inside of you, long before your conscious mind dares to claim it. She, the woman in the mirror, no longer searches her face for proof of worth. Her power is not painted on her lips, nor stitched into her clothing. Her beauty is not negotiated with the world, but radiates from the unshakable foundation that she has survived herself. She has faced a shadow, the inner ghost of abandonment, rejection, and betrayal, and instead of hiding, she stood there, trembling but unyielding, until the darkness recognized her as its equal. And you, too, may not yet realize this subtle metamorphosis unfolding within you. Perhaps you believe you are still fragile, still unready, still drowning in the weight of past mistakes. Yet, if you look closely, you will see that something inside has already shifted. Your anima, the feminine archetype of intuition, creativity, and emotional depth, has begun to dance more freely. The fragments of self once trapped in shame are slowly returning, like birds finding their way home after winter. Healing rarely appears as triumph. It often feels like exhaustion, like sitting still after years of running, like tears that come not from despair, but from release. The Stoics knew this. They taught that the truest strength is not the absence of pain, but the refusal to be destroyed by it. To endure, to transform suffering into wisdom, is the greatest rebellion against fate. You have already begun this rebellion, even if you do not call it healing. The signs are there, small, delicate, profound. You forgive yourself without ceremony. You walk away without needing applause. You choose silence over explanation. You protect your peace instead of defending your wounds. You notice beauty again, not as distraction, but as truth. And in this noticing, you become magnetic. For men, for women, for the entire world. Attraction is not born from perfection, but from presence. A woman who has danced with her demons and lived to tell the tale without bitterness carries an energy impossible to resist. It is not the kind of attraction that fades when makeup washes away, or when time etches lines into skin. It is archetypal, eternal, the energy of the survivor, the healer, the sovereign self. This is where the journey begins. In the space between shadow and light, where healing grows unnoticed until one day it blooms as undeniable strength. The first sign is silence, not the suffocating silence of suppression, but the sacred silence of the soul that no longer seeks to justify its existence. In earlier seasons of her life, she spoke to be heard, to be validated, to anchor herself against the terror of being invisible. Words spilled out of her like offerings, hoping someone would declare them worthy. But healing shifts the need. She now understands that explanation is not liberation. It is a chain, binding her worth to another's recognition. So she withdraws, not in bitterness, but in reverence. Her silence is not empty. It is fertile. Within it, the psyche gathers strength, weaving fragmented pieces of the self into something whole. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming who you are meant to be. And this cannot happen when the voice is always reaching outward. It begins when the voice turns inward. This silence unsettles men who are used to women explaining themselves, apologizing for their emotions, filling the void with nervous laughter. It unsettles family members who once depended on her to absorb the chaos with endless words. They feel something has shifted, though they cannot name it. What they feel is her power returning. And you, if you notice this in yourself, take pause. When you no longer rush to answer every question, when you no longer feel compelled to tell your story to anyone willing to listen, when your lips rest softly because your heart is no longer frantic, that is healing. It is the anima, the inner feminine, no longer begging the animus, the inner masculine, for acknowledgement. Instead, they begin to converse as equals within you, balancing action with intuition, thought with depth. The Stoics would call this equanimity, a calm center unshaken by storm. Trauma once made you reactive, ready to defend, explain, or prove your side. Healing without announcement makes you sovereign. Silence, then, is not absence. It is presence, the kind of presence that draws others nearer without you needing to summon them. A man feels this shift instinctively. He feels the way of her gaze, the quiet in her voice, and something ancient inside him stirs. He realizes she no longer asks to be chosen. She has already chosen herself. And that is irresistible. For it is not noise that makes a woman powerful. It is her ability to be still in her truth, without fear of being misunderstood. The second sign appears in the way she begins to carry her pain. Once, the memory of betrayal, loss, or abandonment was a dagger that pierced her every time she touched it. She flinched at the thought, recoiled at the echo of past voices, and drowned in the tide of old images that visited her in the night. Pain was a tyrant, dictating her reactions, twisting her choices, chaining her to the past. But healing, though subtle, reshapes the relationship. She does not erase the pain. No, that would be amnesia, not transformation. Instead, she allows it to breathe, to exist as part of the architecture of her soul. Like cracks in ancient stone, the wounds remain, but they no longer destabilize the structure. They become symbols of endurance. Jung taught that the shadow cannot be destroyed, only integrated. The woman who is healing does not seek to banish her sorrow, but to hold it in her palms without trembling. Her suffering becomes a teacher, not a tyrant. And you, perhaps you notice this shift within yourself. A song that once shattered you now makes you pause, but you do not crumble. A memory that once broke your breath now lingers like distant thunder, but it does not collapse your sky. This is not numbness. This is power. In the language of Stoicism, she has moved from pathos to logos, from raw reaction to the quiet discipline of wisdom. Pain still knocks, but she decides whether or not to open the door. A man who once thrived on exploiting her wounds feels this shift instinctively. His tactics no longer work. His silence does not ignite her panic. His absence does not unravel her world. His cruelty does not pierce as it once did. And though he cannot name the change, he knows. She has slipped from his grasp. Healing does not announce itself with fanfare. It reveals itself in these small moments, when memory no longer enslaves you, when triggers lose their claws, when you recognize that survival is quietly turned into strength. And there is something magnetic about this evolution. To carry scars with grace, to live with wounds without letting them define you. This is beauty beyond youth, beyond surface, beyond illusion. It is a kind of beauty that makes others lean closer, without even knowing why. The third sign appears in the silent architecture of boundaries. Once, she built them as desperate barricades, high walls of fear, barbed with anger, sealed by silence. They were not gates of sovereignty, but fortresses of survival. She feared closeness, and yet she feared abandonment more. So her boundaries cracked and shifted with every emotional storm, sometimes vanishing entirely, sometimes suffocating her own heart. But healing, though invisible to the untrained eye, refashions the way she says no. Boundaries no longer grow from terror. They grow from reverence. A reverence for her time, her body, her energy, her spirit. She no longer builds walls to keep others out. She plants gardens and chooses carefully who may walk their paths. Jung wrote of individuation as a process of becoming whole, a slow reconciliation of the many selves within. Boundaries are part of this wholeness. For in learning to honor the voice within, she discovers that saying no to another is often saying yes to her soul. And perhaps you felt this shift without realizing it. The invitation you once accepted out of guilt now receives a gentle refusal. The apology you once gave reflexively now remains unsent, because you finally see it was never your burden to carry. The touch that once left you uneasy is now met with a firm redirection, not in rage, but in quiet certainty. This is the alchemy of healing. Fear no longer governs the lines you draw. Love does. Even men feel it in ways they cannot articulate. A woman who once bent to avoid rejection now stands straight, and her presence commands respect. Not by threat, not by force, but by the radiant clarity that emanates from her very being. She does not beg to be chosen, because she has chosen herself. And there is power in this kind of boundary, not the brittle defense of a wounded soul, but the serene strength of one who knows her worth. To stand near such a woman is to feel both invited and measured, and only those aligned with truth will remain. The fourth sign reveals itself not in noise, but in silence. Once, her silence was heavy with shame. It was a silence of suppression. Words bitten back, truths buried in the throat, emotions drowned before they could breathe. Silence was her prison, her evidence of powerlessness. But healing transforms silence into something else entirely. It becomes her presence, her gravity, her power. She no longer fears the space between words. She no longer rushes to fill the air with apologies, explanations, or desperate attempts to please. Instead, her quiet becomes a language of depth. Jung spoke of shadow work, the slow excavation of hidden truths buried in the psyche. Silence becomes the arena for this excavation. In her stillness, she hears the whispers of her inner child, the wounds of her anima, the echoes of her unlived lives. Where once silence was avoidance, now it is integration. And you may not even notice the shift at first, but others will. A man accustomed to her immediate replies suddenly finds himself unsettled by her pause. Friends who once relied on her constant reassurance are met with her listening gaze instead of hurried comfort. In her quiet, people encounter themselves, and that unnerves them. For silence, when wielded with healing, is not emptiness. It is a mirror, and in that mirror, she no longer collapses into others' chaos. She observes. She discerns. She waits. This patience unsettles those addicted to control, but it magnetizes those who recognize true power. Because her silence is not absence, it is presence distilled. This is how healing speaks without words. Her quiet no longer betrays her. It protects her. It shapes her. It announces, without sound, that she is no longer available for what does not nourish her soul. And in this silence, men who once sought to dominate her attention now find themselves disarmed. For desire is born not in endless chatter, but in the mystery that silence holds. Healing has taught her that not every truth must be spoken, not every wound must be displayed, not every provocation must be answered. The strong woman does not roar to prove herself. She allows her silence to echo where words would be wasted. The fifth sign emerges in the way she meets solitude. There was a time when being alone felt unbearable. Solitude was a cruel reminder of rejection, abandonment, or emptiness. It was the echo of every man who left, every friend who betrayed, every family bond that fractured. Her silence at night was once filled with phantom voices, the noise of memory replaying itself until exhaustion blurred her tears. But healing reshaped solitude into sanctuary. She no longer runs from her own company. She learns to sit with herself, not as an enemy but as a beloved guest. Carl Jung described individuation as the path to wholeness, the integration of all the fragmented parts of the self into a unified soul. Solitude becomes a temple where this union occurs. She discovers that the space once feared is the very chamber where the soul restores its power. And so, she walks alone but not lonely. She eats alone, but not in hunger. She sleeps alone, but not in despair. Her aloneness no longer signals loss, but choice. She no longer seeks company to escape herself. She welcomes company as an addition, not a cure. Men sense this difference in her. The man who hoped she would beg for his attention is startled when she does not chase. The friend who expected her to always answer the phone is surprised when she allows it to ring. This independence does not harden her. It softens her into truth. She realizes no one is responsible for filling her emptiness because the emptiness has dissolved. Solitude no longer terrifies her because it no longer means abandonment. It means freedom. And here lies a paradox. In solitude, she becomes magnetic, for there is nothing more irresistible than a woman who needs no one, yet chooses with discernment. She is no longer bound by desperation, but guided by resonance. She can stand in silence with herself, and that quiet radiance calls forth those who are truly aligned. Healing does not make her avoid intimacy. It makes her redefine it. Intimacy is no longer dependency, but a sacred meeting of two whole beings. She does not collapse into a man's arms out of fear of being alone. She meets him as an equal, because she has already met herself. The sixth sign is revealed in the crucible of conflict. Once, every disagreement was war. A raised voice would pierce her like a blade. A careless word would unravel her for days. She would either lash back with fire or retreat into silence, carrying the wound like a stone lodged deep in her chest. Conflict meant danger, danger of abandonment, danger of betrayal, danger of being unseen. But healing alters her rhythm in these storms. She no longer fights to win, nor retreats to vanish. She pauses. She breathes. She witnesses. The shadow within, once quick to inflame, has been acknowledged, honored, softened. Jung taught that what is denied in the unconscious rules us like fate, but what is faced becomes power. And so, she has faced her anger, her fear, her need for approval. They no longer command her. Now, when conflict comes, she listens, not passively, but with grounded presence. She no longer mistakes every raised tone as an assault on her worth. She can discern between another's projections and her own truth. When he shouts, she no longer hears her father's voice. When he withdraws, she no longer feels her mother's coldness. She recognizes this is him, this is now, this is not the past. And because she no longer confuses the present with the old wound, her response transforms. She may still speak with fire, but it is controlled flame, not a wildfire consuming everything. She may still retreat into silence, but it is a deliberate pause, not a collapse into shame. This steadiness disarms those who expect chaos. The man who once provoked her to see her unravel is startled when she stands calm. The friend who tried to guilt her into compliance falters when she refuses with grace. Conflict becomes less about survival and more about clarity. This is healing in its rawest form, the alchemy of pain into wisdom. She does not avoid confrontation, nor does she hunger for it. She moves through it as one who has learned that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to remain whole within it. And in this way, she no longer loses herself in battles. She no longer sacrifices her soul to preserve a bond. She learns that true love does not demand self-erasure, and true strength does not need constant defense. The seventh sign whispers itself in the way she greets life with gratitude. Once, every day was a battlefield where she measured losses more than blessings. The absence of what she longed for was louder than the presence of what she had. She lived in the shadow of not enough, chasing after completion through people, achievements, or distractions that only deepen the hollow ache. But healing has turned her eyes toward the subtle gifts. She no longer dismisses the small moments, the way the morning light kisses her face, the sound of her own steady breath, the taste of food she chose for herself. She does not need grand miracles to affirm her existence. Life itself as it is becomes sacred. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the soul's unfolding into its full pattern, not perfection but wholeness. Gratitude is the language of this wholeness. It is not naive optimism, nor denial of suffering. It is the quiet recognition that even pain carved a vessel that now holds her strength. She sees her scars not as shame, but as scripture written on her body, proof of survival, proof of becoming. And gratitude births acceptance, not resignation, not passivity, but surrender to the mystery of life as it unfolds. She no longer clings to what left, nor curses what never came. She trusts that everything has its season, that endings birth beginnings, that even silence carries wisdom. This acceptance makes her radiant. People sense in her presence a calm magnetism, a serenity that does not demand attention yet draws it. She no longer scrambles to be noticed, for she is already aligned with something deeper than approval. She is aligned with herself. And here lies the final paradox. The woman who no longer grasps desperately for love becomes the one who attracts it effortlessly. The woman who no longer hides her wounds becomes the one who inspires others to show theirs. The woman who no longer fears life's storms becomes the anchor others search for when waves rise. She does not even realize how much she has healed. She simply lives differently. She breathes differently. She carries herself with the quiet majesty of one who has walked through fire and emerged whole. This is the hidden grace of healing. It does not arrive with trumpets or fanfare. It arrives quietly like dawn, at first unnoticed, then undeniable, until one day she looks back and realizes the woman she once was is no longer here, and the woman she has become is finally free. If these words found you, it is not by accident. They arrive because a part of you is already healing, already remembering its strength. So pause, take a breath, and honor how far you've come. And if this journey spoke to you, let it continue. Subscribe, so the next time your soul hungers for meaning, you will find it here waiting. Share this with someone whose silent scars deserve to be seen. And leave your reflection in the comments, for your story may be the mirror another woman needs to recognize her own becoming. Remember, healing is not a destination. It is a rhythm, a return, a rebirth. And you, even now, are already walking that path.